Hey folks, this is Kelani. Now that we've finally got into patch 8.15, the highly anticipated, and quite late at this point, addition of the Zandalari Trolls and Kul'tiran humans gives you even more options when it comes to what race you want to play in your adventures through Azeroth. But while new options are always nice, are these new candidates actually worth re-rolling for? Or even race changing one of your main characters to? That's a pretty loaded question for sure, so let's break it down to a few categories and go from there. Let's have a look at the class availability, both new races' racial abilities in terms of power and flavour, and also see what these new kids on the block look like in various sets of armour. Let's get started. So one of the most important factors when considering whether or not you want to play a specific race has to be their class availability. If the race can't be the class you're wanting to play, well, I guess the conversation kind of ends there, doesn't it? So what classes can you be if you're looking at the Zandalari Trolls? Quite a lot, actually. It's easier to go through the classes that you can't be as a Zandalari because you can be pretty much everything. The only ones that are unavailable include Warlocks, Death Knights, and Demon Hunters. Both Demon Hunters and Death Knight aren't surprising at all. No allied race has those two options, so Warlocks are really the only thing you can't be at a Zandalari Troll, which might be a bit surprising. Everything else is open season, including another options for Druids on the Horde side, which we'll touch on again in a moment. Over on the Alliance side, the Kul'tirans are almost as versatile. They can't be Death Knights, Demon Hunters or Warlocks either, but they also can't be Paladins. Zandalari Paladins are pretty huge, we had to fight for that one for sure, but that leaves everything else open at least, including another Druid option for the Alliance side. Why is that so important? Why do I keep going on about Druids? Because both of these new Druid races come with some super special new Druid forms. The Kul'tiran Druids follow the path of the Wicker Man, so their forms are all pretty creepy with a mix of leaves, wood, and ghostly skull masks. They all look pretty cool, and they're very different from the usual animal-based forms. The only one which looks a little disappointing to me is the Boomkin form, because it looks like the base Boomkin form with a few branches thrown in. You might like the new look, but I always kind of disliked the bulkiness of the Moonkin form to begin with, though saying that I guess you can't really complain if you're wanting to play a Kul'tiran for that very same bulkiness. Over on the Horde side, the Zandalari Druid models are all fashioned after, surprise surprise, dinosaurs. They're a little more unique than the Kul'tiran models in my opinion, and they all fit pretty well. You've probably seen many of these models while questing, because I think every form is a dinosaur you can actually see out in the world. The only exception is the Moonkin form, which is an entirely new model, with new animations and everything else. While the Kul'tiran Moonkin form uses the same animations as the typical Moonkin, Zandalari Druids are a little special. People have been laughing a little at their running and jumping animation, but for a humanoid pterodactyl, I think it works quite well. The casting animations are really cool too, and it's nice seeing a thinner Moonkin form instead of the dev team defaulting to a huge hulking bird thing. So if you want to play a Druid and you like the idea of fresh new forms and in some cases new animations, that might be enough of a reason to re-roll one of these new races. But what about their racial abilities? I heard some of them were brokenly overpowered. Well, that wasn't ever going to last, but that doesn't mean some of them aren't going to be really useful for a few classes or specs. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this because we've covered the new allied race racials quite a few times, but it's worth doing it once more because all of this information is actually live now, so we know what we're going to play with. Let's start with the Kul'tirans again. They have Haymaker, wind up a massive punch to stun your enemy and knock them back quite a fair distance. In terms of flavour, it's pretty hilarious. These beefy humans certainly have quite a wallop to knock back almost anything that far, so it's super fun to play around with. While levelling a caster, creating some extra space between you and a target is certainly useful, but it's not really going to make or break the race as a whole. It could have some interesting uses in PvP. I've heard of rogues stealthing to the middle of Eye of the Storm and winding up their haymakers to knock people off the edge, so it could make for some hilarious results if you can use it reliably. They also get Brush It Off, a free 1% versatility, and you heal for 2% of the damage you take over 4 seconds. The verse is nice for a variety of classes, but you get a free minor version of Monk Stagger just for being a beefy human. That's actually kind of ridiculous. For healers or DPS, it's a nice little boost, but for tanks, I think that might actually be something to really consider. That's a perfect addition to any tank's arsenal, because they're always going to be taking damage. That's their job. So they'll make full use of that racial almost no matter what type of content they're running, so that's a pretty strong racial if you play a tank class that is available to the Kul'tiran humans. The next racial is Child of the Sea, 50% longer breath and 10% faster swim speed. A nice flavour racial, but does practically nothing in terms of power unless we end up underwater for any significant length of time in the near future. Jack of all trades gives you a little boost in every profession, which again is pretty cool for flavour. These Kul'tirans know what they're doing when it comes to living off the land and creating their own stuff, but it might actually have some decent potential. The last 5 to 10 skill points of any given profession are usually where the good stuff is, and getting there 5 points earlier might actually help you make a decent profit in future expansions. And the last racial is Rime of the Ancient Mariner, 1% reduced frost and nature damage, which is going to be pretty inconsequential at the end of the day. So, some really nice flavour in the racial abilities for Kul'tiran humans, but not really a great deal of power unless you're a tank. The Brush It Off racial might be worth swapping your toon over to a Kul'tiran, but anyone else won't really gain a huge benefit. What about the Zandalari Trolls? There's some really unique racials going on here, so let's go over it real quick. The big one is Embrace of the Lower, which is actually a wide variety of buffs to choose from depending on which lower you want to embrace. Embrace of Parkour gives your abilities a chance to grant 4% crit for 12 seconds, Embrace of Kragwa gives you a chance to gain armor and health when you take damage. Embrace of Bwansandi gives your abilities a chance to deal extra damage and heal you. Embrace of Akunda gives your heals a chance to heal a little extra. And Embrace of Gonk gives you 5% movement speed. And then Embrace of Kimball is the last one, which gives your attacks a chance to apply a bleed which can stack up to 3 times. You can only change your lower once every 5 days. This is a commitment after all. You're praying to a god. So it's got a bit of a lengthy cooldown on it, and to change lower you actually have to visit their shrine in Zuldazar. This may be one of the single most awesome racial abilities in terms of lore and flavour. I love that they included this racial and got it to work so well. You offer up gifts to these enormous beings of power, and you gain their boon in return. I hope they can do something similar to every race going forward, but what about the racial's actual power? Well, as it turns out, most of these buffs aren't all too amazing except for 2. Kimball's Bleed is decent for some classes on single target encounters, while Parkour's crit buff is actually pretty useful on anyone who likes crit, which, let's be honest, is pretty much everyone. So if you want to make the most out of this racial, you're actually going to be stuck with just those 2 options for the most part. Pterodax Swoop allows you to call forth a Pterodax from out of nowhere to reduce your falling speed, so it's a free Goblin Glider on a 15-minute cooldown. That's pretty useful in the grand scheme of things. If you were using Goblin Gliders before, it kinda just saves you 1 glider every 15 minutes, which will certainly add up over time. The next racial is Regenerating. This one has changed quite a few times, but they settled on a ramping heal over time, so it heals more the longer you're able to channel it, which heals for your max health if you can channel the entire thing, and it's interrupted if you take any damage. So not quite as powerful as it was initially, but healing for your full health every 2.5 minutes is always going to be valuable, whether it's downtime between pulls in Mythic Plus dungeons, or during an intermission in raid encounters, or if you can sneak it off during an arena match. This racial has some insane potential, even if it doesn't increase your damage directly, so that's pretty huge no matter what class you play. And the very last racial we have is City of Gold, which increases the amount of gold you get from creatures by 2%, which isn't really going to mean much in the long run, but adds a nice bit of flavour. These Zandalari Trolls know how to collect gold, alright. How do you think they made an entire temple out of this stuff? So overall, Zandalari have some awesome flavour racials with a really strong heal. That means you're going to benefit from being a Zandalari almost no matter what class you're playing, and you also have a crit buff there to give you some damage too, so it's a pretty well-rounded race. As a quick note, all racial abilities amount to less than a 1% difference in output for damage and healing, pretty much no matter what. There's no real outliers here. If you really want to min-max this stuff, you do you, but it's not going to leave you significantly behind if you just want to play a race for the lore, flavour or fantasy of that race. If you compare the Zandalari Trolls to the Kul'tiran humans, it seems like the Zandalari will be a better all-rounder race because you can benefit from their multitude of racials on any class or spec, whereas the Kul'tiran seem more favoured towards tanks specifically. Alright, that's the racials ticked off. How about how these races look? If the race just doesn't look fabulous in your favourite transmog, well that just won't do now, will it? So let's see if either of these races fall into any of the usual transmog pitfalls, like hunched over postures or bad scaling of textures and parts. Kul'tiran males are pretty big, so expect some rather large shoulder pads and some huge belts thanks to that beer belly. Some of the older expansion belts back when they were getting out of control and starting to look more like heavyweight wrestling awards, those kind of belts look pretty silly on Kul'tirans in my opinion, because it's just scaled up even further. I don't care too much for huge shoulders personally, but if that's something you like, then Kul'tiran humans will be right up your alley. They do have a slight hunch, kind of, but it's more because their huge shoulders just meld into their neck and you don't get a real separation there, which might cause a few issues, but it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as Tauren, Trolls or Undead. I think the current Raid Mythic gear looks pretty good on them. Comparing each armor type, I would say they look best in the heavy looking gear. Definitely the plate stuff, and some mail gear looks pretty good too actually, but as you get lighter it sort of works against the physique a little bit. It would have been pretty awesome to get the skinny Kul'tirans as an option for casters to really offer up some diversity, but for the most part I just can't see these hulks sneaking around with such heavy footsteps. I'm sure you could find some cloth or leather transmogs that they can really pull off, but in my opinion this race makes more sense when they're a class that can take advantage of their larger form. Kul'tiran females don't really suffer from any of the same issues as the males. They're smaller and they have a lot more distinct separation between the shoulders and neck. Their shoulder pads aren't out of proportion either, which leaves them looking very similar to a human male actually. Gear looks pretty darn good on them no matter which armor type you're going for. They can pull off the heavy looks from plate and mail like the males, but they look good in leather and cloth too. They really do resemble a normal human male, just with a little extra on the hips and their chest. So if you want to look fabulous as a Kul'tiran no matter what class you're playing, I would say the females wear their armor a little better than the males for the most part. There isn't really anything I would complain about. So what about the other side of the story, the Zandalari Trolls? These chaps look cool without even adding any armor on top, but once again they seem to pull off most armor types really well. Probably because there aren't any huge scaling issues and there's no hunchback. Finally, a male troll that isn't hunched so far over that you never see most of their chest, and every headpiece does something weird to try and make sense of the posture. Zandalari Trolls stand tall and proud, which means you typically get a better look no matter what transmog you end up equipping. My favourite sets are definitely the troll or druidic themed ones though. All of the natural colours, the feathers, the totemic vibes. It fits a Zandalari Troll way too well. So if you decide to play one, you're absolutely going to have to run around some of those old dungeons and raids to pick up any and all troll related sets. Even if it's just the tiniest little bit trollish, that's a set you're going to have to get. The female Zandalari Trolls are pretty much the same as the female Darkspear Trolls, they're just a little bit bigger and they have their Zandalari customization options thrown in for good measure. So if you like how a female troll looks right now with their transmogs, how they hold their staffs, how they cast their spells, it's pretty much the same thing as a Zandalari. You can get the same look on a Darkspear Troll, so the only thing that's really going to change there is the racial abilities, which we already touched on. With that being said, I think female trolls look great in most armor types, though I would say the lighter stuff looks a bit better than the heavy plate gear on their smaller frame. There are a few other factors which might be important to you, but I figure the special features of a race, their racial abilities, their origin and lore, as well as how they fit into armor, are going to be involved in everyone's decision one way or another. All that's left to decide is this race worth re-rolling for, or perhaps even race changing for? You could go through however many lists you want, but it's your choice at the end of the day. If you want to race change to a Zandalari Troll because they look awesome in male gear, go for it. If you want to run around as a hefty human and that's pretty much all you care about, with maybe a sneaky haymaker every so often, that's more than enough reason to play a Kul'tiran human. If you want to swap, make the swap. Don't let anyone tell you it isn't worth it. On an interesting note, before we head out, it looks like a lot of players have already decided that Zandalari Trolls are worth the effort to reroll or the cash for a race change. Zandalari Trolls are apparently already the third most played race amongst some of the best raiding guilds in the world on Horde side, behind Blood Elves, who are number 1 obviously, and Darkspear Trolls, who are number 2. So a lot of players have already made the switch at the cutting edge of raiding progression, and that doesn't take into account all of the players below that, leveling up from fresh from 20, or maybe just swapping over and aren't in mythic guilds. That's pretty crazy if you ask me. But that's all for this video. Have you decided to make the swap to one of the new allied races? What made you pull the trigger? Was it the racials, or maybe something more cosmetic? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon. You can see their names floating by on screen. If you want to join these lovely guys and gals, you can find a link in the description below. Remember to leave a like just below the video before you leave, and if you want to see more, make sure to subscribe. But apart from that, thanks for watching folks, good luck and have fun, and as always I will see you next time.